we're going to talk about the 4 tips on coaching your hosts, setting up your groups for success. My name's Charlie Holt, and I'm the author of the Christian Life Trilogy, which is a small group study designed for Lent, Easter season, and Pentecost season. And we'll talk more about that at the end of the program. But I'd love to introduce Alan White, who is a coach of small group ministries in various churches. Alan, would you introduce yourself?
Hey there, Charlie. I'm still Alan White, and you're still Charlie Holt, huh?
That's right.
Anyway, my name's Alan White, and I have been in ministry for over 25 years, mainly as an associate pastor of the church. But in the last 11 years, I've had the privilege of coaching about 1,500 churches, as small as 40 members, as large as 40,000 members, and pretty much everything in between. And really enjoy working with churches, encouraging pastors and their staff to get their people connected into groups and show them some hopefully easier ways of making that happen.
Great. And Teresa's going to be logging out and logging back in because we were having some technical difficulties. I pastor a church in Lake Mary, Florida that has about 350 people that come on a weekend. And we've been working at small groups for the last 15 years and had varying degrees of success. But one of the most important things, if you're going to have a small group ministry over a course of several years rather than just doing it as a one-time program, it's critically important that you create a structure that can support your small groups for the long haul, so that after the 6-week curriculum is up, or if in our case for the Christian Life Trilogy, it's a 20 weeks of material, but even after 20 weeks, there needs to be some kind of support system so that congregations can sustain their small groups over the long haul. And one of the absolute keys to doing that is creating a coaching structure where those small groups are ministered to on a regular basis. So, Alan, could you perhaps speak about what does it mean to be a coach of a small group, and perhaps some of the reasons why that's an important thing?
Yeah, the importance is, Chuck Swindoll said years ago, is that every person that you see is a person in need of encouragement. I think as people step out into a new role, they're unsure of themselves and leading a group, they need some encouragement. The day that they have 10, 12 people signed up to be in their group and only 3 or 4 of them show up, they need some encouragement, because sometimes it's just a matter of it's a bad week or life got in the way, and they need to know that it's not them. They're not the one that caused that. I actually like to think of it the other way of, that God orchestrated that meeting. So what is it that God means to accomplish with 3 or 4 people in a meeting instead of having 10 or 12 people there? And I heard some pretty amazing stories on meetings that, might have seemed otherwise to be a disaster. So a coach is the one that kind of keeps them going. I mean, you think of a coach in sports, you have a running back that's out there and he gets, clobbered, and he's seeing, stars and hearing birds tweeting and doesn't know which way to go. And, the coach is the one that, puts his arm around him and helps him shake it off and refocuses him and puts him back in the game. And I think for leaders, sometimes we get so caught up with, well, I'm tired and I work hard, we had to get the house clean, and, we're kind of becoming weary and well-doing, if you will. And it's the coach that comes back and says, yes, but look what a difference that this group is making in the lives of these people that you're a part of, and begins to refocus them and get them back on mission.
Excellent. Yeah, I like, the opposite of the word encouragement is discouragement. And it's true for everybody in ministry that we get discouraged sometimes. I get discouraged as the pastor of the church, and fortunately I have good people in my life that can draw alongside of me. Sometimes it's my wife that is the encouragement. I think Teresa's back on at least.
I'm back.
Are you picking up a lot of feedback? Oh, Georgette's back. Okay. I think I'm hearing things in your background, Georgette. Are you able to mute your microphone?
Yes, just a minute.
Okay. So, one of the things that when you're thinking about a coaching structure for small groups, Alan, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of how to organize that?
It depends on the size of your church. I mean, I go off of, Jethro's advice to Moses in Exodus 18 was that you have leaders of tens, leaders of 50s, leaders of hundreds, and leaders of thousands. And the leaders of tens, I would take those to be our small group leaders. And the leaders of 50s and hundreds would be, coaches in this scenario. Leaders of thousands, well, if you have thousands, then maybe you need a tier above that. And in some cases, you only need the coaches, and that becomes your small group team. But I would find, people with good character, people that have some experience with groups. But by and large, the biggest factor are people that care. People that care about the leaders, they care about what they're doing, they care enough to pick up the phone and make the phone call. And sometimes that's hard to find. I mean, I've recruited people that they wanted a title. I've recruited people that said they were going to do it and didn't do it. I recruited people and didn't explain real well what they were supposed to do, and then they felt like a failure because I didn't I didn't define a win for them. And but I think that and having that structure. I was at a church in Northern California where, we had 30% of our adults in groups, and I was completely overwhelmed because I was trying to coach all of them single-handedly. And it was just too many phone calls, too many meetings. And then as soon as I developed coaching structure, we actually were able to go from 30% to over 100% of our adults in groups. And a big part of that was me trying not to manage the whole thing by myself.
Yeah, and so when you were at that large church, how many small groups did 30% represent?
Well, at that church, we were about 800 adults on the weekend, and 38% was about 30 groups. And
30 small groups, wow.
Yeah, and so trying to manage 30 groups myself, I mean, I didn't manage them very well, and I had other responsibilities as well. But even, earlier in that church, when we were more along the 300, 350 line, we had 10 groups. And we didn't really coach them because we were small enough that, we were all communicating, we were all talking, and at the end of the year, they all quit. And we said, why aren't you continuing as a group? And they came back and said, well, we felt like we were a lone ranger. We thought, well, how will they feel like they were a lone ranger? They could have come up and talked to me or to our senior pastor at any point, but they just didn't feel like we weren't asking them intentionally what was going on with their groups. And they didn't feel supported, so they did very much feel like a lone ranger.
Sure. Now, for 30 groups, how many coaches do you think are important for 30 groups?
There's a lot of variables in this. I wish I could say 6, and it would be great. But there's a couple of variables. One is whether or not the coaches are leading their own group, or whether the coaches' sole responsibility is coaching other leaders. So if their sole responsibility is coaching leaders, then you can probably look at having 5 to 7. If they're leading their own group in addition to helping a few others, then that might look more like 3 or 4, or sometimes less if you're starting out. I often will ask experienced leaders just to help for, the length of one series, and I only ask them to have 1 or 2. In addition to their group. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the ability of the coach. I think, a minimum for a coach to understand about a person is the name of that person's spouse and the names of their children. Because when you have a friendly conversation with somebody, you pick up the phone, you say, hey, how you doing? How's Brooke doing today? And that's Charlie's wife. And then and I don't know the names of all of your kids. I see them all on Facebook, though. They're all beautiful. But anyway, those are kind of the basic conversations that we have with people. And so, right. To me, coach can take on as many leaders as they want as long as they can remember the spouse's name and the children's name. And so for some people, if they go from 1 group to 2 groups, they're going to be overwhelmed. They're not going to have that information. And others, I had a guy one time that he personally coached 25 groups. And we had 3 services in our church. He was single. And so what he would do is he would come before the first service and he would stay till after the last service. And on a Sunday morning, he would actually make contact with almost all 25 of his leaders every Sunday. And so that way he did some other phone calling and some other things besides that. But, he was able to make that personal touch and find out how they were doing. And that really was the key. Now, I wouldn't recommend, having your coach take on 25, because like I said, I didn't do very well with that. And but I would say, find out what they're how many they're able to manage, and then also, depending on whether or not they're leading a group, will determine how many they're able to manage as well. And they don't have to lead a group. If you're starting out brand new, and you have some mature people in your congregation, and I would emphasize this, mature people that you enjoy working with, because that's an important point, and invite them just to help. And they don't need to be experts in small groups. They need to be that caring person that's going to pick up the phone, call them, and say, how are you doing? How's your group doing? And then just to encourage them, to answer questions for them, to pray for them when you think about them. That, to me, is really the essential of a coach. And I've been through all kinds of coaching things. I've read books on coaching. I've been to seminars on coaching. And when it comes down to it, that coach has to care, and that coach actually has to care enough to do something. And if you don't have that, as we would say in South Carolina, you ain't got nothing.
Right. Well, one of the things at our congregation is we had 30 small groups that were doing the Christian Life Trilogy for Lent. And so one of the things that we did was we divided up the groups to several coaches, and we also created a second position that was a prayer person. So we had a coach that would call through the different hosts of the small groups, and then the prayer person was also there as a support to email and ask for prayer requests and be a support. And between the two of them, they probably each had I think we had 4 sets of coaches and prayer people for the 30 groups. So they probably had 8 or so for each of those coaching teams. Well, how do you Teresa, you had a thought? And welcome, Teresa. You want to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Teresa with the technical difficulty, apparently. So can you hear me now?
Yes,
the question?
We got you.
Okay, awesome. Well, no, I do actually have a little bit of input. I mean, just from the standpoint of being coached as a small group leader, what we have done, or as a community group leader, what we have done is quarterly. Now, of course, this could align with the campaign, but quarterly we do get together, and we'll have a guest speaker, or we'll have just a very short session on the latest and greatest, new ways to develop interaction, new ways to keep in touch. Just whatever is going on really even in the church, to have ways to just throw ideas off of each other. So we actually have like formal coaching sessions on a quarterly basis.
Now, Teresa, in your congregation, you've been coached. Have you also served as a coach of other small groups?
I have. I've done both.
Okay.
So I am serving as a coach to a small group currently. And it's actually, again, termed. It's 16 weeks, and we have a curriculum, and it's great because it makes it easy when they ask me to coach these women, and they're all women, through this particular program. I had a lot of confidence in being able to do that because I did have a curriculum. I do have a curriculum, so I think that's important as well. I mean, you do have to care, obviously, like Alan said, but it's. To someone that's being asked to coach for the first time, I think it's important for them to have some sort of curriculum to work through.
So one of the slide that's up right now says how to get enough coaches. One of the things that we always struggle with and are challenged with, and we've talked about how to recruit hosts, but here we're talking about how to build the actual support staff of the small group ministry. So what are some of the points, Alan, that you would want to make in this particular topic?
Yeah, I've done various things over the years. Some right, some not so great. I used to invite a potential coach who was an experienced group leader. I would invite them out to lunch. I'd pick up the checks. So they would feel obligated. I would, have the job. Yeah, I'd have the job description, all lined out, and then we, try to get them started. Some of them worked. Some of them liked the title. Some of them, didn't do anything. And then we get to the place where, we doubled our groups in a day and it went from 30% to 60%. Within 6 months, we had, 1,000 people in groups and 800 on the weekend. So we had to do coaching, catch up very, very quickly. And, I used to limit the fact that, well, how can I coach all of these new leaders if I'm not adequately coaching the leaders that I already have? And so I one day woke up and I said, now, wait a minute. If I doubled my groups, that means half the leaders know what they're doing, the other half don't know what they're doing. So I'll just pair them up together. And I'd been at the church for 12 years, so the invitation went like this. I sent them a letter, and I said, hey, we are completely overwhelmed. I need you to take this one new leader under your wing, call them once a week, answer their questions, and unless you absolutely can't do this, I'm counting on you. And you have to be there a long time in order to make that kind of it wasn't an invitation as much as it was a demand. And I had one leader that came back to me and said that there was no way they could possibly take that on. And so I excused them, but all of the rest of them either did it or didn't do it. But as we begin to do a sequence of campaigns, and once we had a few leaders going, rather than beating myself up on how inadequately I was coaching my current leaders, I just thought, well, you know what? I have people with experience that have figured out good enough how to keep their group going. So why don't I tap those and invite them to walk alongside a new leader? And so as we would begin to recruit new leaders, just prior to that, I would gather together my existing groups, classes, others who would be participating in the series. I would tell them about the series, give them all of that information, and then I would say, we're going to be inviting, people to host these groups. Our coaching structure is going to be completely overwhelmed, and I need you to help me. So if you would walk alongside someone for 6 weeks or 7 weeks of the study, then I would really, really appreciate it. Now, what I did was, that because we're inviting people who are willing to step out and to open up their home and host one of these groups, it's kind of a trial run for small group leadership. Well, I was doing the same thing with coaching. I was taking an experienced leader and saying, would you help for 6 weeks? Now, it wasn't a lengthy commitment, so they could say yes to 6 weeks, but also in that time, they could figure out if they liked coaching, and I could figure out if they were any good at it. And so when it came to the end of that 6 weeks, if they did a good job, I said, would you be interested in continuing to coach, and could you possibly take on a couple more leaders? For the ones who did very little or weren't effective or didn't do anything at all, I would say thank you very much for 7 weeks of your valuable time. You fulfilled your responsibility, and thank you very much. And that was a much easier way for them to exit than for me to have to go to them and fire them because they're volunteers, and that's very awkward to fire, any kind of volunteers.
That's right. Well, and that's a great strategy, because what you're doing is basically establishing a need, and when people feel needed and that there's an actual thing for them to do, they're much more likely to say yes to it. Nobody wants to just sit on a committee or do something and not get utilized. But if there's a great need out there, they'll definitely step up, and you'll find those people. So what's the kind of person that you would want to see in this role? And maybe Teresa might want to take a stab at this. The kind of people that you've seen make ideal coaches of small groups, small group hosts and leaders.
Right. Well, I'm going to say probably the biggest characteristic that and it sounds kind of weird, but I want to stay away from, is that person that feels inclined to teach versus lead. So we really need facilitators. We need good listeners. We need people that are very humble and that are not afraid to have conversations where there may be some disagreement, that embraces the opportunity to really, in a group, to really reflect on what God's Word says. So because we have a lot of conversation, and they're not always eye to eye. So that to me, some of those characteristics are key. Teachers are awesome because they can explain things really well, but they're not necessarily the best facilitators. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, you may be talking about actual small group leaders and facilitators. One of the things, one of the things that what we're want to think about is also the support system that goes to that helps those small group leaders to encourage them in the task that they're doing. So one of the things that that Alan pointed out was that we want to find people that have had some experience being a small group leader and have done their own host for a while, and not just hosted it for a 6-week program, but perhaps have made the turn and been able to sustain and keep their group alive for a long period of time. Those have some track record and experience of how to maintain a small group for the long haul. What would you say, Alan? Some other?
Well, I think that you do. I mean, along the lines of what Teresa was saying, you want somebody who is a good listener, not somebody that's just going to get on the phone and talk that host or facilitator's ear off. Somebody's going to listen to them. And it has the ability not just to listen to their words, but kind of listen to what's behind their words. Because somebody who's new at leading a group may, they may sweep a few things under the rug and not realizing that it's more of a problem than what they think it is. For everything from people being inconsistent with their attendance to consistently being late to somebody in the group who talks too much, these sorts of things, that could actually be a problem for the group. And so for that coach to kind of hear them out and say, now tell me about this person you said that's very talkative in your group. How are the other group members reacting, and how are you handling that? Well, I don't know how to handle that. Well, if the coach has dealt with that before, then they can share from their experience. If they haven't, they can go to somebody who knows, or even go somewhere like on my blog or Mark Howell's blog or somebody on my blog, and you type the words "shut up" into the search, you'll find a blog post about how to deal with overly talkative people in your group. And and so, so some of these sorts of things kind of help them navigate through. I know in some parishes that if groups are new to them, they may not have experienced leaders. But again, caring, mature people that if they don't have all the answers, will at least help them to identify problems and find answers for them. And I'll give you Charlie's cell phone number, and he'll be glad to take those calls.
Absolutely.
Alan, and Charlie, I missed that question initially, but as a coach, that just exactly what Alan was saying. I agree with that. Reading between the lines, being an encourager, and then being a sounding board to be able to talk through those challenging situations of that individual that that wants to take control of the group, that wants to talk too much, or the one that doesn't respect the time of other individuals in the group. And we talk through those. We create environments where we can have those conversations offline and just coach in individual and specific situations. And then, there's always duct tape. You don't have to.
That's right.
Or somebody will say, what about that group member that they're very inconsistent in attending? Well, my simple answer is just move the group to their house, and then they have to show up because it's at their house. Or the other thing you could do is, you could maybe you're passing them in church or what have you, and say, oh, yeah, remember the group on Tuesday night? And they go, oh, I don't know if I was going to make it. You say, I was really counting on you bringing, the beverages that night or bringing some of the oh, you were? Well, now they have a reason and a purpose to be there, and maybe you just motivated them to get to the group when otherwise they were like, I wasn't so sure. So, there are those kinds of little tips and tricks, and they're around out there on blogs and various places. But again, helping leaders to identify things. I had one group that they had a member of the group, we'll call her Louise because that was her name, and they had to do everything to her liking. Every study, every activity, everything the group did had to be to her liking. And I finally, you know, through the coach, we went back to the leader and said, listen, what you were doing in your group to accommodate Louise is actually harmful to your group. And the leader's eyes kind of got big because they knew that she was kind of a pain and they wanted to keep her happy, and, you know, the group was putting up with all of this. But once you put the label harmful on it, then that became a whole different ballgame. So then we had to address it, but not as the pastor, not as the coach, not as the group leader. We had to address it as the group to say, let's find a middle ground. We can't always go to the restaurant you want to go to. We can't always do the study that you want to do. And they weren't willing to kick her out, but, you know, and she was a little, you know, a little, you know, open to what they wanted. But anyway, we could go on and talk about horror stories. Most people are not going to face those. They're going to face the simple things that are going to trip them up. And if you have a coach there to intervene, you know, let's say somebody's recruiting members to the group and they get turned down a couple of times and they're discouraged and they think maybe it was a mistake that they stepped out to do this. Well, just somebody that says, you know, everybody that I've invited, you know, didn't say yes, and let's pray about who God intends to be in your group, and let's keep at it and see if a little persistence can kick in there. But again, it's that coach being in there to help them, because otherwise we just have so much stuff, so many things to distract us in this world that it would be real easy to give up and be busy doing a lot of other things and not get started at all. And we want to discourage the busyness and the distraction and encourage them to focus and to continue moving forward with their group. And when they do have a problem, to have somebody who's a friend, somebody that they've built a relationship with, that they can call up and say, I've got this thing going on in my group and I don't know how to handle it.
Right. One of the things that, you know, so having somebody that's got experience and some Christian maturity makes for very good qualifications, and you already named it before, but somebody who cares is the absolute best kind of person to have as a coach of small groups. And having a caring person that's in the process of the ongoing life of the small groups, it's not in the dynamic of the small group, but is outside of it, a sounding board, a go-to person, can actually head off some challenging dynamics before they can bear a lot of negative fruit with just little small tweaks and encouragements. You know, let's pray about that difficult person, or let's come up with a different strategy for next week. And so, you know, some of the horror stories that, like you're naming Louise there, maybe could be averted if you have a coaching structure, so that that group could have just had some little tweaks from the host from the start, and that would have been prevented some of the more difficult conflicts later. Let me move the slide along here. And so, what does a coach do? What in your experience, what are the kind of things that they'll be doing as a coach?
Yeah, I think that, you know, you want to keep it simple, especially if, you know, this is a short-term thing, they're busy people, but I would say definitely to put in a call to the leaders once a week, from when they say yes until after the series is concluded. And the reason for that is you need that personal touch. The reason that you have a coach there is you want to have a relationship with all of the leaders, but you personally can't do that. You know, whether you're the group's director, whether you're, you know, on staff at the church or whoever, one person can't be spread that thin. You can't make that many phone calls. So you want to call them every week. It's not an email distribution list. In fact, I've said, and it's kind of pointed, but I've said that if you're coaching through email, you're not coaching leaders, you're spamming them. And so the key is to pick up the phone, to have that personal touch, to ask them, you know, what's going on in their group, to, you know, answer their questions, to give them encouragement, to pray about it. Keep it that simple. But then the other side of it is, and this is where our work would come in, is that if we expect the coach to do these things, then, you know, there's an old adage that only the things that are supervised get done. And so it's our
Right.
responsibility to call the coach and to say, what are you learning from your leaders? What are you hearing from your leaders? Making the assumption that the calls are being made. Because nobody wants to get a call that says, hey, if you called your leaders this week, nobody likes that. And so then if they say, well, no, I haven't had what are you learning from your leaders? Well, I haven't had a chance to connect with them yet. Well, why don't you connect with them over the next couple of days, and then I'll call you on Thursday, and we'll see how things are going. Well, now you've given them a deadline, and they know that you're going to call back, and it's going to be accountable. One of the things I learned from one of my coaches teaching me, he said that expectations should be three things. This isn't in your slides. They need to be clear, they need to be reasonable, and they need to be accountable. And if you don't have that, and I know a lot of times we shy away from, well, they're a volunteer, and I don't want to be too hard on them, but if we're asking people to do an important job, and this is an important job, then we need to make sure that that job is being done. And if we don't follow through and offer that kind of accountability, as simple as calling and saying, what are you hearing from your leaders, then what we're communicating is your coaching is not that important.
Right.
That you're filling a space, you're filling a role, you're filling a position on the org chart, but it's not that important. And it is important. So clear, reasonable, and accountable. That's the lesson of the day.
Yeah, I like it. And I think I've often heard you get what you measure too. It's the same kind of idea is that if we aren't being attentive to the coaches, then how would they expect to be? How could we expect them to be attentive to the hosts? We all need encouragement. Everybody needs somebody to be encouraging us, and so part of the role of the pastor might be to encourage the staff, and maybe there's a person on staff that is coaching these that is supervising the various coaches. Or if it's a smaller church, it might be the pastor that is supervising the one or two coaches that they have. So what's your experience of how coaching works? I mean, some of the things, Teresa, that you've seen at your congregation, what do they typically do?
Well, the coaching that I've either given or received, either one, because I've done both, but it is typically sort of regularly scheduled conversations. Not a lot, like Alan said, not a lot of email correspondence, but a lot of lunches and just an opportunity to talk with. Now, in my particular case, my coach that I have is a staff member. So she's a direct staff member, okay? But the ladies that I coach, obviously I'm a volunteer. So my desire is to have one-on meetings with each of the potential hosts that I'm coaching. And again, we try to do that on a rotating basis, on a quarterly basis, and really just to kind of give them that open platform for conversation and questions to prepare them. And then if they really, I mean, in the beginning of somebody taking on a host, I do like to coach them around things to expect. And that just goes from experience, you know, that you go back over 5 years and say, well, I've dealt with this, I've dealt with that, and just know that it may come. In fact, it probably will come if you continue on. So be ready and let's practice. And I always kind of make a joke around it and say, well, this is kind of the canned response. You know, you got to be comfortable and confident when you know a situation arises and you're addressing it. So there's mainly just one-on, you know, definitely telephone calls, but I love getting together with, you know, for coffee, and I love being invited to lunch by my coach as well.
There you go. Well, and it's the thing that I've noticed in ministry, and this is where it's great. You know, a lot of times it's the difficult challenges and the situations that come up and so on that actually provide the opportunity for the greatest growth of us as Christians. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we think, well, I'm failing as a host or I'm failing as a coach because I had this difficult situation come up. And it's exactly the opposite. It's that those are the moments that those of us who have been in ministry for a long time have learned are actually the places where God is going to do some great things and some incredible things. And so this is the time, this little crisis, this little challenge is the time to let's start inviting the Lord into it and be praying about it. And so I always, whenever I'm coaching somebody, I always try to listen to the content of what they're saying, the issues, and then the other side of listening is not just listening for the things that they're saying, but also listening for the emotion that they're feeling. So if they're anxious about it, or if they're angry, or if they're sad because somebody just in their group said that they have cancer or some kind of terminal illness, these become the opportunities to take these kinds of challenges into prayer and say, Lord, we're really sad that we have this situation, this group, and so-and-so has cancer, and it's just overwhelming, and we don't know what to do. Please help us. And sometimes a coach just drawing alongside of a host that's feeling a little overwhelmed or doesn't know what to do and offering that as a prayer request can be one of the most powerful things from a ministry standpoint that you can do in building some spiritual growth in that person's life.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important thing to remember because, as we've done this series of webinars, we can talk about strategies. We can talk about, these are things that you can put in place, and if you do step 1, 2, and 3, churches in general have success. But, the reality of all of this is that we're doing the Lord's work. And to do God's work, we need God's power. We need God's ability. And so, we can try to, execute a strategy and do it to a T, but the bottom line is it's God's the one that puts us on people's hearts. God's the one that draws people together. And, when we have an enemy that's very real, likes to attack us and discourage us, so even in coaching, God's the one that can break through, can encourage leaders. And so that's something we, not to forget. It's not just all of the strategies and all the nuts and bolts of this is how you launch this, but it really is, it goes back to the power of prayer and how God wants to use his people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the most difficult challenges that I've noticed with being a coach is that people find it difficult to contact the hosts that are in their care because of the busyness of people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the places where our coaches can get very discouraged.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a place where you can actually lose coaches. So Alan, do you you have a methodology of starting somebody off kind of slow as a helper, letting them get some experience and kind of testing their spiritual gifts and their skills at being a coach before you actually officially launch them as a coach. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is you take, people that have experience, people that are of good character, and invite them into a short-term relationship, to walk alongside the leaders. But even how you do that will, greatly determine their effectiveness. And so years ago with my small group team, I walked into a meeting, and I said, well, how's it going? And somebody piped up and said, well, this would be going a lot better if some of these leaders would actually call us back. And my first reaction was I thought, oh, man, I do not want to do a whole meeting on this. I said, whose calls do you return? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, you don't return the call of every person who calls you. Whose calls do you return? And what we came down to was kind of two categories. We return calls to people who are important to us, and we return calls about matters that were important to us. I said, and so here's my challenge. I said, here's my challenge to you. I said, how do we become those people? And so one of the things that was happening was when the new leaders were coming to the briefing to learn about how to do the curriculum, I was running the briefing. And then I would hand off a list to my coaches saying, I need you to call these leaders and see how they're doing. And then this is where they weren't getting calls returned because the new leaders, they didn't know who the coaches were and they didn't know why they were being called. So they weren't important in either regard. And from the coaches' standpoint, I mean, let's face it, everybody hates cold calling. and I was making a cold call. So we changed it. And from that point on, what I did was I took the experienced leaders, I invited them to come to the briefing for the purpose of meeting a new leader face to face, and then they would be initiating the relationship there. So I actually got to a place in the briefing. Now, notice the language I used. I said, let me introduce you to some very important people who are going to help you get your group started. So now
Great.
they fit into that category. And so they met face to face. And so, Doug would meet a new couple that were going to lead a group. And so now they knew Doug, and Doug's going to say, if you don't mind, I'm going to call you once in a while to check in on you, see how you're doing. And then we eliminated a great deal of that problem because now they met face-to-face. Now, I've had some coaches over the years that maybe their leaders were a little more elusive, and so they basically just stalked the leaders and introduced themselves and said hi on a regular basis until eventually they formed enough of a relationship they could coach them. But that's kind of a rare extreme. I don't recommend the stalking.
Right. No, I don't either. But one of the things that I'm hearing from you, and I think it's so important, is the idea of just human relationships and why those, and being aware that there are human dynamics, and that I've made a mental note to write down this. We return phone calls to people that are important to us and matters that are important to us. That's going to be my takeaway from this whole session, because that is so true, and it's that goes for everything. But how do we become an important person to another person, and how do we make sure that the things that we're calling about are important?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not returning the calls to these telemarketers that are leaving messages wanting me to purchase my Medicare supplement now that I'm 65, because I'm not. I'm 51, and I got
right.
on the list, and now they're all calling me. I don't care about that. The only time I pick up the phone is to tell them to stop calling me.
Exactly. Well, that's great. So that's all from us, and we're very grateful for your participation. Hi, my name's Charlie Holt, and I'm the pastor of St. Peter's Church and the author of the Christian Life Trilogy. Over the years, I've had a hunger to see solid small group materials developed in and around the core faith of our church, found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that He was buried, and that He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." The Christian Life Trilogy seeks to focus on the things of first importance: the crucified life, the resurrected life, and the Spirit-filled life. To explore what it means to walk the way of the cross, to be raised with Christ in newness of life, and to be filled with all the fullness of the Spirit of God. As a pastor, every year I'm asking myself, what am I going to do for Lent this year? Listen to the impact the Crucified Life materials have had on those who participated during Lent.
I think very often you look at the empty cross, you look at just the season of Lent, here we go another year. This gave people an opportunity to go deeper and to really find out, what does this mean? How does this apply to my life? What does this mean for my depth of spirituality?
To think of what Jesus was going through, it just made the Easter experience, the entire Easter experience, the most profound one I've ever had.
The average Christian, when he thinks about the last 7 phrases that Christ said on the cross, may take them at face value. But when we find out from this session on the crucified life, the meaning behind those words and how it applies to us, it definitely matures you as a Christian in a very strong way. I look at things totally different than I did before.
I think the crucified life really went to a place in people's lives where they're longing, but maybe don't even know they need. I've heard over and over again how God's touched people's lives and brought them to a deeper level of faith and intimacy with Christ through this Crucified Life series, and how our church as a community went through it together.
What you have just heard is the transformational power of the first study in the Trilogy, The Crucified Life, 7 Words from the Cross. The entire Christian Life Trilogy is a 20-week journey into the heart of the gospel and the heart of the Christian life. These 3 studies are not only deeply theological in their intent and purpose, but also deeply practical as they call us to be transformed into the image and likeness of God through His Son, Jesus Christ.
Within just a couple of weeks, people were really sharing some of their biggest challenges, some of the toughest things that they're going through, and then watching other people in my group literally just wrap their arms around them, pray for them, and get involved in their lives. And that stuck and still sticks to this day. So that was, I think, what we needed, and that's what God did through the material.
God is calling the church back to His heart, and you're invited to be a part of that by participating in the Christian Life Trilogy church-wide campaign. I hope this resource will bring tremendous renewal to the church, your congregation, and to you personally. My prayer is that the Lord will bring all of our hearts back to the things of first importance as we walk the way of the crucified life, the resurrected life, and the Spirit-filled life.